Rick Esenberg from the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty is standing by on the Middleton Ford hotline. Family owned and your good neighbor Ford dealership for nearly 75 years to talk about this, the happy stuff and then the maybe not so happy stuff. But let's start with this referendum. Organization and dollars were put behind the efforts on this referendum, and helpfully it also made sense to people and it passed. So how does this help specifically?
Well, this is one of these things you ought to have learned in kindergarten questions, Vicki. Our elections are hotly contested. Somebody's going to win, somebody's going to lose. The losers have to accept that it was fair. And in order for them to be able to do that, they've got to have confidence that the people that are running the elections are neutral, and they're playing it straight down the middle, and they're not shading to one side or the other. And in order to facilitate them feeling that way, it's a good idea if we don't have interested parties funding the administration of the election or lending out activists to help to be embedded within the government and run those elections. And so, there was a lot of arguments here about, well, you don't know if anything happened with the Zuckerbucks that were wrong and all this type of thing. And my reaction to that was, it doesn't really matter. We shouldn't have interested private parties funding our elections because we want everyone to have confidence that they were administered fairly.
Darn right. And it doesn't matter that you can't prove it. By the way, nobody ever actually set to prove it or disprove it. When someone says, well, you can't prove that Zuckerbucks had an impact, we can say, well, you can't prove it didn't. And nobody's bothered to undertake that independent investigation of that.
Well, but the thing that we can say, though, and I should point this out, is that we know that the distribution of those funds had a partisan skew. That is, they went disproportionately to larger, to more heavily populated parts of the state, but on a not per capita, greater than per capita, disproportionate. And we know that they were associated, at least statistically, with about an 8,000 vote increase in turnout for Democrats. And so, this is the kind of thing that we worry about. Even if nobody engages in what we would call fraud, if the money is then distributed unevenly to benefit one party over another, that also undermines the fairness of election administration.
Well, yeah, but
something we don't want.
What it was doing, and we'll get to, in fact, I'm going to have a long discussion on Biden bucks coming up. But what it was doing was increasing voter turnout in heavily dense Democratic areas, and that is the only place where the money was going. Because it was actually doing it through the manipulation of the process itself. It wasn't a campaign to get out and vote. That's different. You want to spend $6 to $9 million in Kenosha, Racine, Milwaukee, Madison, and Green Bay to put out flyers or to hire people to knock on doors. That's one thing. But that wasn't what was happening. Racine bought a mobile voter van and drove it around to the densest Democratic areas. Madison had democracy in the park. We didn't even have, chain of custody of ballots assured. Absentee ballot drop boxes, same problem. We'll get into that in a second here. Purchased with private money. So yeah, but it's appalling because it was the process of the election that was harnessed in service to a partisan outcome. And that's what really ticked people off. And that we didn't stop it before it actually got rolling is something that I think a lot of people will just never forgive the legislature for.
Yeah, again, for me, it's just a simple. It was just a simple statement of what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. And I'll say it again, having interested private parties funding our elections is not a good idea. And the interesting thing about the debate over these amendments is that nobody ever tried to argue it was. they would say, oh, this is just to appease election deniers and that type of thing. Forget election deniers.
Yes.
Forget who won the 2020 election. This isn't a good idea. We shouldn't want this. People who are, support Democrats wouldn't want, the Koch brothers funding election administration. They, they wouldn't. And you know what? They'd be right. And so I think that we're finally able to have the law reflect what I think is best practice with respect to this.
So on absentee ballot drop boxes, that's the other shoe here. If it were just these two amendments passing, we didn't have to worry about absentee ballot drop boxes. Even with Biden bucks, which is the harnessing of federal agencies to do basically what Mark Zuckerberg did privately in 5 cities in Wisconsin, I'd feel okay. But we are now potentially staring down the barrel of absentee ballot drop boxes. Tony Evers is trying to put pressure on the Wisconsin Supreme Court to reauthorize absentee ballot drop boxes. We already have a case on this, Rick. But, if we are dealing with that with zero control over those things, again, zero control, we don't have rules on where they would go, how they would be secured, how we could, make sure we monitored chain of custody. We didn't have people stuffing 30 ballots in a drop box after hours. That may be okay. But how is this going to play out in Wisconsin, do you think?
Well, we'll have to see what the court does. I mean, you're absolutely right. We have a case on it. I know. I won it. And it was less than 2 years ago that we got that decision in the Tigan case. And look, if you love drop boxes, if you think drop boxes are a great thing to have for voters, then fine. You need to go to the legislature and you need to change the law. And when you change the law, what you have to do is you have to put in a set of requirements to make sure these things are secure and adequately monitored. But because the law doesn't permit drop boxes, it doesn't set forth any criteria for making sure that they're secure and monitored, because they're not supposed to be there. And so, and the court, going back to the court and asking them to reverse the Tigan case won't do that, because the court doesn't have the power to specify conditions for the security and monitoring of the drop boxes. And so, what we ought to do, and this goes back to the point that I made earlier about maintaining public confidence in elections. We maintain public confidence in elections by following the rules that we agreed upon before we went into it, and on an ad hoc basis deciding that, we think drop boxes are a good idea, so we're just going to have them, even though the law doesn't say we should have them. In fact, it says that there are only 2 ways to return an absentee ballot. Drop boxes are not one of them. Instead of simply following the law and changing it if we think that would be changed, we go to court and we try to get the court to do what is the job of the legislature and not the judiciary. And I hope the court resists that, but we'll see.
Yeah. So what is the argument? Because it's hard to see what logic is presented when the Tigan case was pretty easy. It was kind of facts on file. This is the law. This does not comport with the law. Let's compare. This is the law. Okay, I read the law. Now I'm looking at Dropbox. These 2 things do not fit together. What's the argument to bring him back?
Well, there really is no argument. The argument is that, we like drop boxes. We don't think there's anything wrong with drop boxes. But that's not an argument that the Supreme Court has the power to consider, right? Its job is to read the law and interpret the law, and the law says that there are only 2 ways to return an absentee ballot. You either place it in the United States mail or you bring it to the clerk's office. The voter brings it to the clerk's office. Those are the only 2 ways, and that means there can be no drop boxes, located, in libraries and grocery stores or wherever you might put them.
Union halls.
You want to have that. Yeah. If you want to have that, you have to change the law, and that hasn't happened. And so, no matter how great you think drop boxes are, we can't have them.
But what if the court gives them to us anyway? Is there a challenge that can then be run up that could potentially supersede the desire of this court to tie everything to the Wisconsin Constitution, because they don't want anything reviewable by the United States Supreme Court. But is there a potential argument that could be presented in time in the event that this court does what I think it's going to do, and that is ignore the law and ignore the Constitution and just do what they want to do because Tony Evers is already putting pressure on them to do it?
You know, it's possible that there could be a challenge to the placement of these things. So, you know, if they were placed in some way that was designed to give an advantage to one side, or if they were placed in a way which discriminated on the basis of race or some other protected class, including we put them all in heavily minority areas, I think that could be the basis for a challenge. We'd have to really see what the court's rationale is, and it's hard to anticipate what the court's rationale would be because, as I said, there really isn't a very good argument for this. I think the statute is pretty clear. The other thing that you have to keep in mind with the Teigen case is it wasn't just about drop boxes. It's also about ballot harvesting. It's also about having the parties hire people to, you know, go out and collect absentee ballots and then either return them or not return them based upon, you know, how they think they were voted. And that, I've always said, is an occasion of political sin. That's not something that we should tolerate. There was a congressional election that was thrown out in North Carolina because, in that case, it was the Republicans who engaged in that type of behavior. And, you know, partisan activists would sometimes not return the ballots that they had collected. And so we don't want that to happen either. And just as with drop boxes, the statute doesn't permit it.
What do you think the timeline on this case is?
Well,
how long? That my concern is they walk it up to the very end. We get ballot drop boxes. It eventually gets overturned or whatever. And exactly what you just predicted, which of course would appall people, would be happening in Wisconsin.
Well, tough to walk it back too far because although some of these places I think still have drop boxes that are just padlocked, it'd be relatively late in the game. It could become too late in the game to actually deploy these things. But I if they're going to do it, they're going to have to do it relatively soon because you've got to get the case argued and you've got to get this decision out, presumably by the end of the court term, which would be sometime in July.
And that strikes me as very late in the game, not early in the game.
Well, it is
Rick
very
Esenberg,
late in the game because the primary is in August.
Exactly. Thanks so much for jumping on the program today. Great to have you on the show.
Thank you, Vicki. Take care.
Rick Esenberg, Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, and thanks very much to Middleton Ford for sponsoring our hotline.